In our last lecture, we learned about how plants take the sun's energy and turn it into useful fuel. Today, we're going to learn about how life itself uses the fuel and burns it to create all the processes that have to go on inside of a typical cell. Now, it turns out that even plants, though they harvest the energy from the sun, need themselves to burn the fuel that they create. So their main job, as we learned last time, is to take CO2, carbon dioxide, and turn it into sugar. That happens inside the chloroplast. And then there are other organelles called mitochondria that burn that very same energy, the sugar energy that they convert from sunlight, and burn the sugar energy and turn it into ATP. All other organisms that don't rely on the sun's energy to make their fuel need to eat other organisms, and then when they eat the organisms, they burn the fuel that is part of that food that they eat. Like in a car's engine, which we all have driving around, there are pistons that have to go back to their original position before a new burst of energy can help push the car forward. So it's a cycle. An engine in a car has a cycle to it. Similarly, inside of the cell, there is a cycle to what goes on inside of the cell because the chemicals that result from burning sugar need chemical handles to kind of hold them and get them ready for the next stage of burning. And those handles need to be regenerated back to the way they were at the beginning. And so they need to come back around the cycle and get back to their original state. So there are cycles inside of the burning process inside of a cell. The starting point for this main process, which is called glycolysis, is glucose. It's a very simple sugar. It has one ring. There's 6 carbons in that ring. In comparison, sucrose, which you probably hear about, has 2 rings, and each of those rings also has 6 carbons. The burning process is called glycolysis, as I mentioned before, and the lysis part means to break. So it's really the breaking up of glucose. Glycolysis is its own little pathway, and it releases some energy, gives a few ATPs as a part of burning one glucose ring. And it feeds into another cycle called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. So glycolysis takes the 6-ring sugar and breaks it into 3 carbon units. And those are what feeds in at the top of the cycle of the citric acid cycle. The end point of glycolysis plus the citric acid cycle is ultimately ATP energy and the release of the products of burning. So just like when you take a marshmallow and you burn it in the fire, you're releasing CO2. You're also releasing water vapor because the sugars inside of your marshmallow contain carbon, which is grabbed on by oxygen and forms the carbon dioxide. But sugar also has hydrogen. That's why sugars are called hydrocarbons. But also, sugar has its own oxygen. That's why they're called, instead of just hydrocarbons, carbohydrates, because it's carbon hydrated with water. So sugar is a carbohydrate, and when you burn it, it releases that hydrate part, which is water. Almost all protein machines that go uphill, for example, the ratcheting machines that we talked about, which you would need to move your car around inside of a hurricane or a giant earthquake, they need ATP to make their ratchets work. So the ultimate process of burning fuel is to release a lot of ATP, to generate a lot of ATP so that the protein machines can work. Enzymes that go downhill, for example, things that are breaking up molecules that are high energy and want to break up, they don't need ATP. But even those enzymes might have some reactions that they have to do uphill. So ATP is needed for almost everything. Now, an activity for you is to actually look at what this cycle, this citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, looks like, because it's very, very complicated. The end result is pretty simple. CO2, H2O, and ATP. But how it does that is absolutely amazing. So what would you say? Do you think that you could someday use this cycle to power your cars? So instead of feeding gasoline and letting it burn up kind of in a very sort of violent reaction, you can get every last drop of the energy out with a cycle like this, some sort of biochemical cycle? It's a possibility. Do you think that this is more complicated when you look at the picture of the citric acid cycle than how the engine of your car works if you open up the hood of your car? It's a tough call. There's lots of parts inside the car, things that you don't even see. But I still think that this citric acid cycle might be even more complicated than the engine of your car. Now, you may wonder how drinks get their fizz. Well, this happens when there's not enough oxygen, especially in things like beer and sparkling wine like champagne. If you bottle up organisms when they're trying to burn fuel and they don't have oxygen to burn their fuel, they have to become more clever and figure out what to do with the things that they're burning. So they still take glucose and they still want to break it into smaller pieces. But in the case of yeast, they break it into 2 carbon pieces that we know as alcohol or ethanol. And that's happening as it's making its fuel. And it's releasing CO2 because it has to release the oxygen pieces that go along with its carbohydrates. The H2O, which is the hydrate part of a carbohydrate, has the O in it. So it's still releasing the CO2, but since that CO2 can't escape, since the whole thing's bottled up, it becomes more and more fizzy. Now, normal wine would be just as fizzy as champagne, but what happens is the wine growers and vineyards release and degas the wine, since this happens over a period of time, so those bubbles don't stay inside. So keeping the cap on in a very tight way with those little wires was kind of a new innovation and led to the sparkling wine industry many hundreds of years ago. In fact, now a typical vineyard will add a little extra sugar at the end to those sparkling wines and champagnes so that they have extra fizz in them as they get going. This process is sort of an alternative pathway to the Krebs cycle. So the sugars get burned in glycolysis and start heading down towards the Krebs cycle, but if there's not enough oxygen, it diverts to another pathway, which is roughly equally complicated. If you're following along in the textbook, you can now read the branch that's called How Do Cells Extract Energy from Molecules? And it takes you from digestion of the pieces of food through the molecular digestion of glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, and will give you a nice picture of how these all fit together.